Late morning in Amboseli National Park, the light had taken on the flat, white quality of the dry season, when the sun seems to strip color from the ground. The heat had already risen high enough to ripple faintly above the soil, and the wind that crossed the plain carried more dust than coolness. In the distance, the shapes of scattered acacia trees stood against the horizon, their thin shadows reaching only far enough to shelter a few stubborn tufts of grass. Between those sparse patches, the land lay bare, open and exposed, a place where nothing could rest for long without the weight of the sun pressing down. It was in one of these unshaded stretches, at the edge where the hard, pale ground began to give way to a low patch of grass, that the young elephant calf lay. From a distance, his shape looked almost like a mound of soil, still and low, with a darker curve where his back rose slightly. But to the trained eye, the scene was wrong. Calves this young rarely lie out in the open and never alone for long. Their place was in the heart of the herd, close to the matriarch's side or sheltered beneath an older sibling. This one had neither. His body was pressed unevenly into the ground, his legs folded beneath him in a way that suggested more than just rest. Ranger Daniel, walking a patrol circuit with two colleagues, was the first to notice. They had been moving along the edge of a shallow dry wash, following its curve north, when the stillness ahead caught his attention. He slowed, lifted a hand in a small instinctive signal for the others to do the same, and narrowed his gaze against the brightness. The shape did not shift, even as the wind stirred the sparse grass nearby. There was no movement of ears fanning for relief, no trunk stretching to pull at the earth or sniff at the air. Daniel changed direction slightly, angling toward the figure while keeping his pace steady. Calves could be hidden by their mothers in tall grass, but here there was nowhere to hide. If this one was alone, it was not by choice. As they closed the gap, the details sharpened. The calf's ears lay flat against the sides of his head, their usual loose sway replaced by a droop that spoke of fatigue. His trunk rested limply in front of him, a pale trace line in the dust marking the slow, absent movements it had made. The skin around his knees and ankles was dusted white, scuffed from repeated contact with the abrasive ground. They stopped several meters away, scanning the open land for any sign of the herd. The horizon was empty in all directions. No moving silhouettes, no swaying backs, no pale clouds of dust that might rise from the steady travel of many feet. Daniel's chest tightened in the quiet. A calf this size, left alone for even a few hours in this heat, was at real risk. The combination of dehydration, heat stress, and the absence of protection from predators created a narrow window for survival. If he could not stand, he would not be able to keep up with the herd even if they were found. The three men stood still for a moment longer, observing before acting. The calf's breathing was shallow and uneven, a short rise and fall, sometimes interrupted by a pause that lasted long enough to draw attention. Daniel crouched slightly, lowering his line of sight without moving closer yet. The animal's flanks quivered faintly, as though each breath took more effort than it should. There were no open wounds, no visible blood, and no clear sign of an attack. But the hip bones were more pronounced than they should have been, and the muscles of his legs trembled even in stillness. Ranger Ahmed, the youngest of the three, shifted the strap of his water canister and spoke quietly. "He's not going to last like this." Daniel gave a short nod, eyes still fixed on the calf. The animal blinked once, slowly, and his gaze lingered on the men without alarm. Too tired, perhaps, to react. A few flies clung stubbornly to the corners of his eyes and mouth, and though an occasional twitch of muscle tried to dislodge them, even that movement seemed weak. Daniel knew the next step had to be made carefully. Young elephants could react with sudden bursts of energy if startled, even in a weakened state. Such energy would cost the calf more than he could afford. They had to approach without triggering panic. The three men shifted their positions, spreading slightly to keep the calf from trying to bolt in one direction. Daniel moved in a gentle arc, closing the distance a meter at a time. When he was near enough to catch the smell, a mix of dry skin, old mud, and the faint sourness of heat, he paused, crouching to test the temperature of the ground with the back of his hand. It was hot enough to leach warmth into his palm after just a few seconds. For the calf, lying here without shade, the heat would drain what little strength he had left. The priority was clear. They needed to get him into the shade. Without that, any other effort, water, rest, or even finding his herd, would be undermined by the rising risk of heat stroke. Daniel looked over his shoulder and gave a small signal to the others. Ahmed moved to the side, scanning again for predators or the distant forms of elephants, while Yusuf, the third ranger, stepped forward with slow, deliberate movements, murmuring low sounds meant to keep the calf aware of their presence. The animal's ears twitched faintly in response to the soft tone, though his head remained low. Daniel extended his hand, palm open, not to touch but to let his presence register at closer range. He could see now the fine cracks in the skin around the calf's trunk where the moisture had long since dried, and the light crust of salt that marked earlier sweat now evaporated. Each sign confirmed what he already knew. This calf was running out of time. "We move him," Daniel said quietly, more to confirm the plan than to give new orders. The others understood the stakes. If they acted too slowly, the heat alone could claim him before the day's midpoint. If they acted too quickly or without care, they could push him past the point of recovery. The balance was delicate. The first step was to encourage movement without forcing it. Daniel angled himself toward a patch of low thorn trees nearby, where the thin canopy could at least break the direct sun. Yusuf moved in parallel on the other side, leaving a path open toward the shade. Ahmed circled to position himself where he could block a drift toward the harder, more open plain. Every step, every shift was calculated to create a sense of direction without pressure. The calf lifted his head briefly, trunk curling weakly as though to test the air. His eyes half closed again, and for a moment Daniel thought he might sink further into stillness. Then, with a slow, awkward motion, the calf tried to bring his front legs under him. His knees shook visibly, and the effort stalled halfway. Daniel remained still, watching. If the calf collapsed fully, his muscles might lock, making it impossible for him to rise again without assistance. That would change the situation from urgent to critical. Ahmed stepped one pace closer, letting his voice carry just enough to draw the calf's attention. The young animal shifted his weight, front legs trembling as he managed to push upright into a crouched stance. It was unsteady, and the movement cost him. But it was movement. They had a chance now, and Daniel knew the margin was narrow. Every second in the sun was another step toward collapse, and if he fell again before reaching the shade, the day might end here, on this patch of dust, under a heat that would not relent. Daniel advanced in slow, deliberate steps, aware that every movement mattered. The calf had shifted slightly since their first close look, lifting his head for a moment before letting it drop again. Even that brief attempt had left him stiller than before, the trunk trailing loosely in front of him with no energy to curl or lift toward the scents in the air. His breathing was uneven, too fast for an animal in complete rest. Each inhale shallow, followed by an exhale that seemed to drain him further. Daniel stopped just far enough away that the calf could see him clearly, crouching to keep his shape low and non-threatening. Up close, the signs became more exact. The skin behind the calf's ears was dry and cracked in fine lines, the kind that came from long hours without cooling in water or shade. There was a thin crust of pale salt clinging to the edges of his trunk, a trace left by sweat that had evaporated in the heat. His legs trembled subtly even while still, a fine vibration in the muscle that betrayed fatigue deeper than simple rest could cure. The curve of his spine and the sharper-than-usual outline of his hip bones hinted at more than just the day's exhaustion. He had been struggling for longer than a few hours. Yusuf stepped up on the opposite side, lowering his pack quietly so the sound wouldn't carry. He didn't speak immediately, choosing instead to take in the calf's posture from another angle. Ahmed remained farther back, scanning the pale horizon through binoculars. Nothing broke the landscape, no shifting line of backs, no cloud of dust from a moving herd. The wind pushed dust low along the ground, blurring the edges of the nearest acacias, but not hiding the fact that they were alone in this stretch. "Breathing's not good," Yusuf murmured. The words meant only for Daniel. Daniel gave a short nod. Without shade, the heat would keep pulling strength from the calf until his body couldn't regulate temperature at all. In this state, he might already be near that limit. The priority was to cool him and restore hydration before his condition crossed the point where recovery was possible. The risk was simple and immediate. If his system failed, there would be nothing to bring him back. The calf shifted again, scraping the front of his knees against the soil in an attempt to fold them forward and rise. The movement stalled before it reached halfway, the weight too much for him to push. His head dipped toward the ground once more. Daniel noted the stiffness in his joints and the awkward angle of his movements. There was no sign of a break or swelling that would point to a fracture, but the way his legs trembled suggested muscle strain or fatigue from overexertion. In these conditions, both would worsen rapidly without relief. Ahmed moved forward slowly, holding his canteen at his side but letting the faint slosh of water carry toward the calf. The animal's ears gave one faint flick at the sound but stayed pressed low. Daniel considered the options quickly. Giving water here could help immediately, but too much at once could shock his system if he was badly dehydrated. Moving him to shade first would protect against heat stroke, but risked draining his energy further. Both paths carried real risk and neither allowed for delay. "Slow. Small sips," Daniel said, keeping his gaze on the calf's breathing as Yusuf unscrewed the canteen. The calf's trunk lifted weakly toward the scent of moisture, the motion unsteady and hesitant. Yusuf tilted the canteen just enough for a thin trickle to run toward the curled tip. The calf drew in the water in short pulls, pausing between each as if weighing the effort. Some spilt against the ground, darkening the dust, but enough reached him to wet the inside of his mouth. It would not replace what he had lost, but it was a beginning. They waited for him to finish before pulling the water back. The calf's trunk lowered again almost immediately, resting against the soil. Daniel studied the fine tremor in his legs and saw no improvement yet. The signs of dehydration were still clear. Without shade and more water soon, his condition could slide past recovery within hours. The decision to move him could not be postponed. "We get him up," Daniel said plainly. Yusuf and Ahmed looked toward the nearest cluster of low acacias, their thin branches casting at least some protection from the direct sun. It wasn't far, 30 meters at most, but the distance could feel far longer if the calf faltered midway. If he collapsed before reaching it, the ground there would offer no better chance than here. Yet staying meant the sun would keep pushing his body toward failure. The choice was made by the conditions, not by preference. The three men positioned themselves carefully, leaving an open path toward the shade. Ahmed moved to the front left, Yusuf to the right rear, and Daniel slightly to the side where the calf could see him clearly. The goal was to guide, not force. The animal needed to feel the space ahead was his route, not a trap. Yusuf began a low, steady murmur, just enough sound to signal presence and direction. The calf's ears twitched once, his head lifting fractionally as if registering the change around him. With visible effort, the calf drew his front legs beneath him again, the tremor in the muscles more pronounced now. Dust shifted under his weight as he leaned forward, then braced with his hind legs. The motion was slow and uneven, his knees shaking, but after a long pause he managed to push upright. His stance was unstable, his head lowered and trunk hanging close to the ground as though the lift had cost him more than it gave. Daniel stepped back just enough to give him room. "Easy now," he said softly. The calf took his first step toward the shade, his legs moving in a stiff, mechanical rhythm. Each step was deliberate, each placement careful to avoid a stumble. His ears hung low and his breathing remained quick, but the direction was right. Yusuf and Ahmed moved with him, keeping the pace slow. The patch of acacias stood ahead, their thin shadows shifting in the breeze. Daniel kept his focus on the calf's gait. Any stumble could lead to a fall, and in his current state, a fall could be the end. The risk was not gone simply because he was moving. But now there was at least a visible shift in the situation. They were no longer waiting for his strength to return. They were guiding him toward the one place nearby that could give him even a small margin of survival. The calf's steps were uneven, each one placed as though testing whether his legs would hold. Daniel moved a short distance ahead, choosing a path that curved gently toward the cluster of low acacias. Yusuf kept to the calf's left, Ahmed to his right, their presence forming a quiet corridor that encouraged forward motion without pressure. The ground here was broken by patches of coarse grass and brittle stems, which the calf avoided with the slow instinct of an animal too tired to waste effort. His trunk hung low, swaying faintly in time with his steps, and his ears moved only when the air shifted. The rangers matched his pace, knowing that if he was pushed too hard, he might fold without warning. Every meter gained under his own power mattered. Once he went down again, getting him up would be far more difficult. The shade, when they reached it, was thin but real, the scattered branches casting a patterned relief over the ground. The temperature here felt immediately different. The sun's weight less direct, and the air moved more freely between the trees. Daniel slowed, letting the calf choose the final steps on his own. The young elephant paused at the edge of the shadow before stepping into it, lowering his head until his trunk brushed the cooler dust. He stood without moving for several seconds, breathing quickly, the muscles along his shoulders rising and falling in sharp rhythm. Yusuf unscrewed the canteen he had used earlier, the faint metallic click drawing a slight flick of the calf's ears. Daniel nodded once, and Yusuf approached from the side, lowering himself so the calf would not need to lift his head far. He poured only a small measure into the air just above the trunk's curled tip, letting it run in slowly. The calf accepted it without pulling away, but there was no urgency in the way he drank. He paused between each draw. The movement of his trunk delayed, as if the signal to take more traveled slowly through his body. Ahmed refilled the canteen from his own supply, keeping the water close but not pushing it forward. They alternated in this way, small, measured offerings to avoid overwhelming the calf's system. Between sips, the animal would hold still, eyes half-lidded, his breathing only slightly calmer than before. The quiet in the shade was broken only by the sound of water shifting inside the containers and the occasional shuffle of a foot on dry soil. Daniel watched closely for signs of change, a lift of the head, a steadier stance, a stronger step. Instead, the calf's posture remained low, the knees bent slightly inward, and the weight shifted uneasily from one leg to another. His tail gave no movement, and his ears, though freed from the full glare of the sun, stayed close to his head. These were not the signs of quick recovery. If dehydration had been the only problem, they would expect to see some improvement now. The absence of that change pointed toward something more, perhaps muscle injury from a fall, perhaps strain from walking too far without food or rest. "It's enough for now," Daniel said quietly, and Yusuf withdrew the canteen. Forcing more water too soon could cause its own harm, and they needed to see whether the calf could maintain standing before offering more. The animal shifted one step, his forefoot dragging slightly through the dust before finding place again. The rangers exchanged glances that carried the same thought. This was not simply exhaustion from heat. Whatever had weakened him went deeper, and it would not be solved by shade and water alone. For a moment, the calf leaned his head into the crook of his foreleg, resting there as if the act of holding it up had become too heavy. Daniel stepped back into the sunlight at the edge of the trees, scanning the open land beyond for any sign of the herd. If they were close, the calf's best chance would be to return to them. If not, the responsibility for keeping him alive would rest entirely here, in this small pocket of shade, with resources that would run out before the day was done. The minutes stretched, the calf standing in stillness, his breathing slow but not yet strong. A light wind moved through the branches overhead, carrying the faint scent of dust and dry grass. Yusuf poured the last small trickle into the dust at his feet, the darkened patch vanishing almost instantly into the ground. The relief of getting him out of the sun was tempered by the knowledge that time had not stopped moving. If they did not find his herd soon, they would have to decide how far they could try to move him in this condition, and whether his legs would hold for the journey at all. The shade gave the calf some relief, but it was not enough to mask the deeper signs of strain. His breathing still came quickly, his legs trembled if he shifted weight, and he stood with his head low, trunk resting in the dust as if anchored there. Daniel's gaze moved beyond him, scanning the flat land where light shimmered above the pale surface. Near the far edge of the acacia patch, faint impressions broke the otherwise undisturbed ground. Shallow ovals pressed into the dust, a line of them moving in the same direction. He stepped closer to study them, crouching so his shadow didn't blur the outlines. The shape and spacing were unmistakable. Elephant tracks, small and large, heading east. The larger prints were broad and deep, belonging to adults, while the smaller ones fell between, some with scuffs along the edges where younger legs had dragged slightly. Yusuf joined him, following the line with his eyes. The spacing suggested the group had been moving steadily, not at a hurried pace. The dust along the edges of the prints was only lightly disturbed, meaning the wind had not yet begun to soften them. Daniel judged them to be less than an hour old, close enough that the herd could still be within range. That meant the calf's separation had happened recently, but in the dry season, even a short time apart could be enough for him to be left behind. Without the herd, he had no protection from predators, no guidance toward water, and no one to shield him from the heat. Alone. He would not last long. Ahmed stepped out from the opposite side of the tree line, gesturing toward the east. The ground there sloped gently toward a low channel, where sparse grass grew between patches of cracked mud. "They went that way," he said quietly, his voice carrying only as far as needed. Daniel gave a single nod. The choice before them was clear. One of them had to follow the trail quickly to confirm the herd's location, while the others stayed to monitor the calf and keep him in shade. Moving him before knowing where they were headed could waste precious strength, but waiting too long risked missing the chance to reunite him with his family. They agreed without hesitation. Yusuf would stay with the calf, keeping him in shade and offering water in small intervals. Daniel and Ahmed would split, Daniel following the main trail, Ahmed sweeping a wider arc to check for any signs of stragglers or a split group. If the herd were close, they could signal for the calf to be brought forward. If not, they would have to reassess how far the young elephant could travel on his weakened legs. The stakes were unchanged. Without reunion, his survival window would shrink with each passing hour. Daniel moved quickly but carefully along the tracks, keeping his steps just inside the edges to avoid disturbing them. The prints led across open ground, where the sun felt harsher without the slight cover of the acacias. Here and there, a tail sweep had marked the dust, or a heavier step had broken the crust of the surface, revealing darker soil beneath. The trail remained clear, cutting eastward toward the low ground beyond the horizon. He kept his eyes ahead, scanning for movement, listening for the low, rolling contact calls that might carry across the flats. Behind him, Yusuf's voice rose in a soft murmur as he tended the calf, the sound faint but steady. Daniel didn't look back. Every step forward mattered now. The tracks curved slightly toward the channel ahead, and the faint shimmer of heat above it made it hard to read the land beyond. Somewhere in that distance, the herd might already be slowing, feeding, or moving on. The difference between those possibilities could determine whether the calf reached them in time, or not at all. The heat had shifted in tone by mid-afternoon, less a sharp weight from above and more a slow, pressing hold over the land. The calf remained in the narrow band of shade beneath the acacias, legs tucked slightly beneath him when he rested, rising only to shift position or take another careful sip of water. His breathing had steadied but was still too quick, and the slight tremor in his muscles had not eased. Yusuf stayed close, speaking to him in quiet tones and keeping watch for any movement on the horizon. Daniel and Ahmed had returned from their earlier search with little to show. Tracks continued east, fading where the wind had moved dust across them, but no direct sight of the herd. The silence of the flats was broken only by the occasional rustle of dry leaves overhead. It was nearly an hour after they had gathered again that the sound reached them, low, rolling, and far away. Daniel lifted his head immediately, listening. The tone was not the high call of warning or distress. It was deeper, carrying through the air in a way that seemed to touch the ground as it passed. He turned toward the east, scanning the open grassland beyond the last low ridge. The sound came again, more distinct this time, and Yusuf stepped out from the shade, his gaze following Daniel's. Somewhere in that direction an elephant was calling, and the wind was carrying the sound toward them. Ahmed moved ahead to a slight rise, raising his binoculars. For a long moment he was silent. Then his voice came back low. "There," he said. Daniel joined him, and through the wavering air he caught the pale, rounded shapes moving slowly across the grassland. At the front of the line, one figure stood out, a large female, her ears still, her head lifted into the breeze. Even from this distance, her posture was deliberate, the trunk held just above the ground, tasting the air. She paused in place while the rest of the group continued forward, their steps slow and unhurried. The calf, still in the shadow of the acacias, shifted his head toward the sound. His ears twitched once, then again, as if trying to fix the direction. Yusuf watched him closely, noting the faint lift in his trunk, a gesture that until now had been rare and brief. The matriarch ahead remained motionless for a long moment before taking a single step toward the wind, the line of her body angled toward where the calf stood unseen. Daniel knew the possibility was real. This could be the calf's mother, or at least the leader of the group he belonged to. If so, closing the distance between them now could mean the difference between survival and loss. If not, and the herd passed without stopping, their options would narrow to almost nothing before nightfall. The air between the 2 points was open, broken only by shallow ridges and scattered grass. It was a distance that could be crossed, but not without risk. The calf's strength remained uncertain, and the effort might take more from him than it gave back. Still, the sound of that call had reached him, and the herd had slowed. The chance, however slim, was one they could not afford to ignore. The wind shifted again, carrying the faintest trace of another low note, steady and unhurried, holding in it the possibility of recognition. Daniel stepped from the rise with measured intent, the image of the matriarch fixed in his mind. She was moving slowly enough that there was still a chance to close the distance, but her herd would not linger indefinitely. Yusuf gave a short nod when Daniel signaled, his hand resting lightly against the calf's shoulder for a moment before stepping back to let him choose the first move. The young elephant shifted his weight uneasily, the muscles in his legs trembling before he committed to lifting his front foot. His trunk swayed low, brushing the dust, each motion unsteady. They would have to keep the pace slow, not just to conserve his strength but to avoid sending him into a panic that could burn through what little energy remained. The line between progress and collapse was thin. On the open flat there was no shelter if he went down, and lifting him again would take more than the three of them could give without help. Daniel stayed slightly ahead and to the side, leading toward the east where the herd had last passed. Yusuf and Ahmed moved in quiet symmetry, one on either flank, creating a channel of movement that guided rather than pressed. The calf followed in uneven rhythm, 2 steps steady, the third dragging, the fourth landing with more weight than his legs could carry. Each stumble sent a jolt through Daniel's thoughts, the knowledge plain. If he fell and could not rise within minutes, the effort might be over. Midway across the open stretch, the calf's front knees buckled, dropping him to the ground in a slow collapse. Dust lifted around his forelegs, the fine particles catching in the folds of his skin. Yusuf crouched immediately at his side, voice low, offering a steady sound while Ahmed stepped back to give him space. The calf's ears flicked once, a faint reaction before he shifted awkwardly to his side. For a moment, Daniel weighed whether to let him rest or push for standing before the muscles cooled. Waiting might ease his breathing, but it would also let fatigue deepen its hold. The longer he stayed down, the smaller his window would become. They worked together without sharp movements, Yusuf on one side, Ahmed on the other, each encouraging him to rise by stepping just enough into his field of view to create forward pull. Daniel moved to the front, taking a slow pace backward to draw his focus. After 2 false starts, legs folding again under the strain, the calf managed to bring himself upright. His stance was wider now, his head lowered, but he was moving again. The final stretch toward the shallow ridge felt longer than the distance allowed. The matriarch's calls were no longer audible, but Daniel trusted the herd had not moved far. Each time the calf faltered, they slowed without stopping, letting him find his own balance before resuming. When they crested the ridge, the ground dipped toward a spread of tawny grass, and Daniel caught movement at its edge, the pale curve of an elephant's back, followed by another. They were still ahead, still reachable. The calf paused there, sides heaving, the wind brushing across him with the faintest scent of others. He lifted his trunk once, holding it in the air, and for the first time since they had found him, his steps lengthened without prompting. The calf slowed as they reached the edge of the grassland, his head lifting, trunk curling faintly toward the air. The shapes ahead were clearer now, a line of elephants moving with the unhurried certainty of those who knew where they were going. At the front, the matriarch stood apart, her body angled toward them, ears still, the tip of her trunk swaying slightly as she tasted the wind. She took a step forward, then paused, the space between her and the others stretching like a held breath. Daniel stopped with the calf just short of open ground, allowing the moment to unfold without pushing. The young elephant shifted his weight, a faint flick of his tail breaking the stillness for the first time since they had found him. The matriarch's posture changed in subtle degrees. Her trunk lowered, then rose again, extending toward the calf, though the distance between them remained. A deep, low rumble followed, the kind that vibrated more through the ground than the air, and the sound carried across the space, reaching him with a steadiness that seemed to pull him forward. He stepped once, then again, each movement slow but more certain than before. The tremor in his legs was still there, but it no longer halted his progress. From behind her, 2 younger females angled outward, their bodies forming a wide arc that framed the path between them. They moved without haste, each step deliberate, their eyes fixed on the calf. The matriarch stayed at the center, her trunk now sweeping downward to graze the dust before lifting again. As the calf closed the final gap, she reached forward, the tip of her trunk brushing along the ridge of his head, resting there for a moment before trailing down his side. He responded with a faint lift of his ears and another flick of his tail, the small gestures enough to mark recognition. The herd shifted subtly around them, the half-circle tightening into a loose wall. One of the younger females stepped in close to the calf's other side, her flank touching his lightly as if to steady him. Another moved behind, closing off the space from which he had come. Within moments, the rangers stood outside a protective ring of bodies, the calf now surrounded on all sides. Daniel felt the air change, not in temperature, but in the sense that their part in the effort was ending. The matriarch rumbled once more, deeper this time, and the herd began to move as one, carrying him with them toward the far side of the grassland. The rangers did not follow. They remained at the edge, watching as the line of gray shapes merged into the shifting tones of the distance, the sound of their steps fading beneath the low whisper of wind through the dry grass. The calf's small form was still visible for a while, moving within the shelter of the larger bodies until the land folded enough to hide them completely. The herd began to move with the slow rhythm of evening travel, the ground beneath them carrying the soft thud of many feet. The calf stayed close to the matriarch. His small frame pressed lightly against her side, her pace matched to his uneven steps. Each time he faltered, her trunk shifted toward him, a quiet touch along his back or side that kept him steady. One younger female stayed on his other flank, her presence forming a living barrier that sheltered him from the open ground. The circle of protection they formed moved as one, and within it, his movements grew more certain, his steps gradually finding a rhythm of their own. The sun had dropped low enough to stretch their shadows far ahead, the grass catching the light in muted gold. The matriarch guided the group toward the deeper plain, where scattered stands of trees broke the horizon. The calf lifted his head once to reach for her flank with the tip of his trunk, brushing against her before letting it fall again. His tail flicked in short, slow motions, an occasional lift as if swatting at invisible insects, but also carrying a trace of returned energy. The herd adjusted their formation without a sound, instinctively keeping him in the center as the open land gave way to taller cover. From their position at the edge, the rangers did not follow. Daniel stood with Yusuf and Ahmed in a loose line, their gaze tracking the gray shapes as they moved farther away. No one spoke. The work of the day had been quiet and deliberate, each choice made with the understanding that there had been no guarantee of success. Even now, the calf's future depended on his ability to keep pace with his herd, to feed, to rest, and to heal from whatever had weakened him. But here, at this moment, he was no longer alone. The wind shifted briefly, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and the low, almost inaudible vibrations of the herd's steps. The matriarch led them into the taller grass, her outline fading first, the others following until only their movement disturbed the sway of the stalks. The calf disappeared last, a small shadow at her side, vanishing into the muted light. The plain settled again into stillness, the fading warmth of the day giving way to the cooler breath of evening. The rangers stayed where they were until the last trace of movement was gone, the image of that slow walk into the grass fixed quietly in their minds.